Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a holistic coach and trauma-informed practitioner. This podcast seeks to break out of the echo chamber of societal narratives that perpetuate our institutions and challenge the status quo of wellness and beyond. Join me as we decolonize our minds, address and use our privilege, and prioritize inclusivity. Here, diverse experiences are honoured, and together we are fostering a space that stands for higher love for all. As a listener, you are not just here to passively consume. You're an ambassador for deep healing and societal evolutions, ready to engage in thought-provoking, challenging conversations. As your host, I'm committed to providing ever-expansive spaces that inspire us to contribute to a world defined by higher love. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Welcome, listeners, to this special edition of the Higher Love with Megan podcast. As we round off 2024, welcome in a pause over the holiday season, reflect on the year gone by, and usher in the start of the next. Firstly, may I offer a massive thanks to everyone who has listened to, shared, and supported the podcast this year. I love making this podcast. It is incredibly meaningful and purposeful for me having these conversations, and I appreciate every single person who has chosen to buckle up and join me for the ride. If you listened to the last episode, our second edition of Coffee with Casper, aka Partner and Husband Extraordinaire, entitled Marriage, Men and Miss Anne Harriman, you'll have heard it's been a massive year not only for the podcast, but also a massive year for me personally and professionally. In January of this year, Casper and I booked our wedding for this autumn, and indeed, we tied the proverbial knot back in October. In January too, I completed my one-year foundational training with Compassionate Inquiry, Gabor Mate's organisation for his psychotherapeutic approach to trauma and addiction therapy. I stayed on the trauma treadmill and rolled straight into the rigorous 6-month mentorship programme, which I completed in August. At the start of this year also, I ran a 4-month project in conjunction with Brighton Women's Centre, providing women from the peer support network with trauma-informed education, awareness and tools to empower themselves in their mental and emotional health. My training and collaborations, in combination with the global events that have taken place over the past year, especially what we have witnessed in Palestine, have all had profound impacts upon me, my work, and the themes of this podcast. As spring of this year emerged, my creative juices began to flow for the direction of this podcast. In July, I relaunched the podcast with the solo episode, Breaking Out of the Wellness Echo Chamber. And that's exactly what I've committed to with the publication of every episode since. A journey dedicated to disrupting mainstream narratives, challenging the status quo of wellness, illuminating where collective traumas and systems of oppression intersect with well-being, and inviting us all to take a stand to create the society we envision for ourselves and for future generations. Leah Kim, host of Voices on the Side podcast, which I can never recommend enough, spoke this so eloquently in our episode, How White Supremacy Harms Us All. She said a word that has really stuck with me this year, the concept of soul loss. What it takes from us, what it takes from our soul, to perpetuate systems of oppression which benefit ourselves whilst harming others. She calls out the identity of being nice and spiritual as blocks against the process of radical decolonization, and outlined the immense amount of work that is demanded from us as an industry in decentering the mainstream narratives of wellness and centering marginalized identities and voices in our road towards collective healing and liberation.
Growing from this decolonized mindset, from acknowledging the harm that this industry has done and continues to do, and actively separating from it. And also, I want to see people, if they say like, Loka samasa suki no bhavantu, which is may all beings everywhere be free. When I hear that these days, I'm just like, do you really mean that? Is that a real, authentic prayer? that you want all beings everywhere to be free? And if so, what are you doing about it? Like, because otherwise, what are you saying? And so until these deep things are thought about and within individual teachers and practitioners, that's what needs to happen to change.
One of the biggest insights I've had in these conversations has been how much I am on this journey with my listeners. I'm at a place where I think having more questions than answers is healthy. We're all conditioned to be experts, to be leaders, to have all the solutions and all the answers. Yeah, I think it's time to stay unanimously humble, curious, open-minded and receptive, and focus on collaborative thinking. We live in a world which polarizes our thinking. We all too quickly make things right or wrong, good or bad, pointing fingers and making wrong. But slowly, I think that we are finding authenticity, individuality and compassion. Over the past months, I've been honoured to connect with guests with whom I have had long-lasting, fangirling love affairs, such as Lisa Lister, and guests who I massively respect in who they are and the work that they do, such as Pat DeVilly, who was my most listened to episode.
I think that would be my encouragement to people. It is also about taking the pressure off yourself. It's not your job to fix anyone. It's not your job to have the answers. It's your job to hold loving awareness and presence for the people in front of you.
I'm not prepared to live in fear of other people's expectations of me or of other people's versions that they would like to put upon me as to who I should be and how I should show up and how that should be. But it's softening slowly, daily, for a short amount of time, so that I can then practice, depending on where I am. Like if I don't feel good in a place, I'm not going to just say, oh, I feel safe, it's okay for me to speak here. The bigger decision in that is to practice discernment and go, that I'm getting out. Like I ain't staying in a room that I don't feel comfy in, for instance.
Something that has really stuck with me from my episode with Lisa is her unapologetic commitment to self-resourcing and knowing her own truth, rather than the story that has been placed upon her by others, by systems of oppression, by the government, by the media, by social media, so that she can stay wedded to the stance of, there are bad things happening and there are bad things happening and she can experience love, joy and pleasure. There are bad things happening and she can take action. Such a great nugget for those who can feel helpless or burnt out in the face of so much adversity and challenge around the world. This point was illuminated again to me in a recent episode with Dr. Nilesh Satguru, when I asked him about the shame and guilt that we can feel, or should I say the shame and guilt that I know that I have felt, when we experience love and joy in our own lives whilst witnessing horror for so many. He asked me so poignantly if I felt guilty about breathing in too much air in case I take it away from another. I loved this. It's become more apparent to me that on the unwavering path to pursue collective liberation, we have to be able to hold it all. Collective pain as well as our own experience, and commit to love, joy and pleasure so that we are a beacon of it for the wider world. This is really the nature of higher love for me, recognizing the very real times that we are in, whilst imagining how we want the world to be and making our physical offering to the planet an example of and contribution to that. Of course, I've been blessed to invite the fantastic Kerry Jarvis into my life, starting with her epic episode disrupting the wellness industry.
Capitalism encourages us to extract as much as we can from one another. I want to be fair to you, and I trust you to be fair to me. Maybe you're doing a lot of unpaid care work. Maybe you're doing lowly paid work that society doesn't value. Or maybe you have health issues, care and responsibilities, or some other issue that is preventing you from being able to afford this product. Like, nobody has to tell me, why they can't afford it, because I think that's another thing that I see happening. People will say, like, apply for this space, but I'm not here to I'm not saying that that's not better than not having any option for people, but I also think there's something potentially undignified about needing to tell someone why you can't afford something, and then potentially the prices of those things are sometimes still quite high anyway, and it's like, Now they maybe feel an obligation to invest because they've been through this application process. So I think we've got to think all the time about the power dynamics involved and how we can just make everything as equitable as possible.
I've continued to be in spaces with Kerry through her group Composting on Join the Portal, a platform where we digest ideas and concepts, and where I personally find weekly sanity and solidarity. For those looking to connect more with group spaces, learn from amazing practitioners away from the wellness equivalent of Big Pharma, I would thoroughly recommend looking at the offerings on Join the Portal for 2025. A real pinnacle for the pod this year was connecting with Fritzi Horseman, founder of Compassion Prison Project, whose moving and powerful video, Step Inside the Circle, featured on the Wisdom of Trauma documentary, was the real catalyst for me venturing into trauma-based work. Fritzi's drive to bring compassion and trauma awareness into the prison system is work that continues to amaze and inspire me, and I am in awe of her as an individual and the work that her organisation does. Our conversation was a real deep dive into the way that Fritzi sees the world and the misunderstandings and outdated systems which perpetuate crime and division and hinder prison reform and healing.
There is no divide. This divide is our own divide of ourselves, right? The divide that we are not enough, so we have to blame somebody else to feel good about ourselves. So we bring that together. There is no divide. The divide is all in our heads, but it shows up in the world, right? And that's a very strategic thing for governments to do, is keep people divided so that they're not really dealing with the real issues. I hope nobody in the government hears this.
I hope they do.
Well, that's what they're doing, right? They want to keep the status quo to keep themselves there.
Yeah.
But is the status quo working? Is this really working? Is it working for you?
A particularly impactful episode for me personally was Lita May Davwan's Rest is a Rebellious Act. Notably because I'm bad at resting, thanks to, capitalism and conditioning. And it was mind-blowing for me to consider rest as taking a stand against oppressive systems towards collective liberation.
On a collective level, that us really leaning into slowing down and resting and taking back power, in that we end up dismantling these systems of oppression. If we are reclaiming back our time, capitalism is going to fall. If we reclaim back our humanity and our connection to each other, colonialism is going to fall. So there are all these things that might seem very basic, but in doing so and us all practicing it, the system won't be able to continue and will have to crumble, and we therefore can then build something that looks a little bit more aligned with our humanness. And that's something that I would love to see.
Kerry Jarvis's book of choice for us to read in this quarter of composting on Join the Portal is Trisha Hersey's Rest is Resistance. Free yourself from grind culture and reclaim your life. Anyone would think that the universe is trying to tell me something. Surprisingly, my podcast producer Lucy's favourite episode was with Sophie Alexandra Were, entitled Beyond Feminism, a bold conversation on celebrating masculinity. Lucy and Sophie have profoundly different definitions and viewpoints of feminism. Yet, there was so much common ground in this episode in terms of desiring the same outcome for us all collectively. An episode which truly embodied the idea that when everyone is in their authentic voice and purpose, we don't need to make wrong, but instead listen and collaborate in order to usher in change.
I actually feel like this war between men and women and the masculine and the feminine is not serving us to actually address the problems in society that we need to address. And that's part of the agenda, I would say. And I think that's where we're not getting it right in society, is like, or maybe we're starting to move towards it. But as an example, women are not meant to work on the same clocks that men work on. They have a completely different hormone cycle. Women should have their periods off work. and actually be able to be encouraged.
A theme that you're probably hearing here is that all of my guests stand against the status quo of systems and the mainstream, and are all, in their own way, change makers and visionaries in the area of collective liberation. Another key theme that has emerged is the homage ode to Indigenous wisdom, outlined in conversation with Alex Sesto and with Rhea, the breath activist, as well as in my own personal studies and experiences with Indigenous tribes from the Amazon, and watching panel discussions hosted by Dr. Gabor Mate that I've had access to. It is surprisingly simple but infinitely complex to consider that the way forwards for us as a society is in some way back, remembering our roots over our progress, learning how to be guardians of the land once more rather than its destroyers, treading lightly over demanding perpetual growth, and recognising the steadfast wisdom carried through in ancient teachings when applied in modern contexts.
But the reality of their situation is that they were existing in a tribe, in a place where there were many other tribes who might come through and want to kill everybody and kill your family. So you had to be a warrior, and you had to show that you have what it takes to be a man in that culture and in that world. And when you would ask the boys, they would say it was the most beautiful day of their lives to be recognized in that way, that they are capable of being that for the people that they love. And yeah, it sounds barbaric, but that's the world that they existed and lived in.
I don't think as long as we're alive, unless we are living, in the middle of the Amazon, we are a part of this harmful machine. And my intention every day, at least, is to heal my relationship with this land before I leave. I think a lot of people in the quote unquote spiritual space tend to take themselves out of that harm equation. And if I can say that my story made me different, is that I'm fully aware of the harm.
Yeah. As a modern society, learning to redistribute sacred teachings in reverence is part of the decolonization process. Again, this is an area where I have more questions than answers, but I find fascinating, and one that I continue to unravel in conversation, as in episodes with the amazing Callie Popham and Jasmine Sara, both yoga teachers dedicated to improving accessibility and inclusivity in their corners of the world.
I look at that now, knowing what I know in present time, and not at all shaming it in any way, because it's just where the yoga world was. But it's ultimately, spiritual bypassing, which is ultimately, when we really look at it, dissociative behavior, isn't it?
When we look at it through that lens, it's quite problematic.
It's really problematic. And it makes no sense, because if we look at yoga in the very essence of what yoga really means and is, beyond the Western kind of understanding of just the asana practice and the physical practice, it's oneness, it's unity, it's the continuity, the connection of everything, the web of the whole. And so, as someone that shares the philosophy of yoga, how can we not address the web of the whole? Because we are all so intrinsically linked. What happens to one happens to everybody.
And there's this whole other piece where the wellness industry is prioritizing profit over people and causing all sorts of issues, but that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the practice itself. It's been distorted by capitalism and commercialization and all this kind of stuff, but the practices themselves are absolutely incredible, and I've seen them support so many different people from so many walks of life, and I think that's beautiful.
Yes, capitalism distorts pretty much everything, doesn't it? So why not yoga as well?
Wow, what a treat at the end of the year to relive these clips and episodes, and what a year for the pod it's been. So where are we going next? Well, first off, as Lita May Davwan would surely support following our episode of Rest is a Rebellious Act, the holiday season offers many of us, if we are fortunate enough to receive it, a time to slow down and to be present. a time to consider how we can stand to in solidarity as we celebrate and come together with loved ones. A time to recalibrate and to incubate along with the natural flow of the world and seasons. But rest assured that in 2025, we'll be back to rock the boat. Thanks to my conversation with Siobhan Strode on this topic, I now have brilliant imagery surrounding this. We can often have a lot of fear of rocking the boat, when actually it's the goddamn boat that's the problem. So the boat I will continue to rock in 2025, breaking out the echo chamber of wellness, continuing the process of decolonization of our minds and hearts, learning, unlearning, listening and centering topics and themes which demand our interrogation and exploration on the journey to collective liberation. A big thanks to you all, my listeners and ambassadors for change. A big thanks to my wonderful husband, Casper, beautiful inside and out, who is my biggest supporter, cheerleader, champion, and sounding board. And of course, a hugely special mention too for my incredible podcast producer and editor, Lucy Lucraft, without whom this podcast would literally not be what it is today. Lucy challenges, stretches, and expands my intellectual and creative process in all the right ways, and who has been the best asset to this pod and to my life in general in 2024. Working with her is a real gift, and I'm pleased and proud to add her to my list of firm, trusted friends, advisors, and inner counsel. Blessings to you all and to your families for the holiday season, and I'll see you soon. Big love, Megan.